In October of 1885, in Stone Post, Kansas, a German named Jacob Brandt began digging his own grave. That is what the town called it, and it did look like one. 4 feet down, 12 feet long, 9 feet wide, cut square into the south face of a low limestone ridge a quarter-mile off the Hayes Road. Not a cellar, not a well, a home. He meant to put a stove in that hole, and a bed, and his wife, and his little girl, and winter there. You have to understand what October was worth in that country. Wheat wanted drilling, corn stood waiting in the field. Every dry day had a price on it, and a man who spent those days digging a hole in a hillside was spending money he did not have. Nobody on the high plains dug for pleasure. By Christmas, the county would have a name for that hole. By the 7th of January, half the county would wish they were in it. Jacob Brandt dug anyway. He stood waist-deep in the prairie with his sleeves rolled, and his wife handed down the pick, and their little girl sat on the dirt pile and sorted pebbles. Wagons slowed on the Hayes Road to look. Some looked twice. I was 12 years old that fall. My name is Nell, and my father was Owen Tate, the carpenter, the best framing man in 3 townships. I will tell you now, before the story goes a step further, that my father was right about nearly everything that year. Nearly. Winter was already loading its wagon somewhere north of us. The talk started at the feed store, the way talk always did. Del Harmon started it. Del Harmon owned the lumberyard in Stone Post, and you will want to remember that, because a man who builds his house out of dirt buys nothing from a lumberyard but a door. Harmon stood on his loading dock that first week of October and said the new German had gone and dug himself a grave, and now all he lacked was the sense to lie down in it. The name took. Names like that always take. By the middle of the month, the hole was Brandt's grave, and Brandt himself was the Gravedigger. At church, the talk was kinder and no better. The woman worried for Katerina Brandt, the wife, and for the little girl, Marta, who was 4. A hole in the ground, they said, with a child, in this country. The words came wrapped in pity, but pity and mockery are cousins, and they visit the same houses. At the sawmill, my father listened more than he spoke, which was his way. When he did speak, men leaned in, because Owen Tate had framed half the barns in the township and had never built a thing that fell. He said the work was careful and the corners true. Then he said the whole idea was wrong from the ground down, and he could prove it 4 different ways, and he would be proved before spring. Jacob Brandt heard all of it. Stone Post was too small for a man not to hear. He heard it through the door of Harmon's yard the day he came in and paid cash for 1 door, 2 hinges, 1 window sash, and 8 feet of stovepipe. Brandt had tied his mule short at the rail, away from the ladies' umbrellas, for the mule could not abide an umbrella, and no one ever learned why. Harmon counted the coins slow, smiling, and asked if he would want a marker to go with the grave. Brandt picked up the sash and the pipe and said nothing at all. He went back to the ridge and kept digging. And here is the thing I remember from that fall, clearer than the jokes. A few men had begun driving out to watch him work. They did not laugh out there. They stood at the lip of the hole, with their reins loose in their hands, and a few of them had started to wonder whether the German knew something Stone Post did not. To understand why a man digs, you have to know what the wind had already taken from him. The Brandts had come to Kansas 2 winters before, and their first winter they had rented a claim shanty south of town. You know the kind. Single-walled pine, board and batten, gaps you could post a letter through. The wind owned that house. It came in under the sills and around the sash, and it moved the curtains on the coldest nights, like someone was walking past them. I will tell you what I saw in the dugout years later, on a shelf above the stove, and I will tell it plain, and then leave it be. A pair of small shoes, smaller than any martyr ever wore, never worn at all by the look of the soles. Beside the wood box sat a cradle, and the cradle held kindling. Katerina Brandt dusted that shelf every day of her life, and nobody in that family ever said one word about it in my hearing. That first bad winter, Brandt had led his milk cow up against the south wall of the shanty and stabled her there against the boards, for her warmth and theirs. A man remembers what the cold costs. He does his arithmetic afterward, when the ground thaws. The answer he came to was not his own invention, and he never claimed it was. Brandt was a vulgar German. His people had farmed the Russian steppe for 100 years, treeless country, colder than Kansas and just as windy. And when those families came into Ellis County in '76, they brought two things in their trunks. Hard red winter wheat was one. The other was the memory of the earth house, the Semlin, the home their grandfathers dug into the steppe because the steppe gave them nothing to build with and no mercy if they built badly. Brandt's grandfather had wintered 60 years in a Semlin, and the old man had a saying, which Jacob translated for my father once, standing at the lip of the hole, in his slow and careful English. Winter owns the wind. It has never owned the ground. It sounded like an old man's saying. It was a system. South-facing bank, so the low winter sun fell into the doorway. 4 feet of cut, below the reach of frost. A ridgepole and cedar rafters, then brush, then 2 courses of sod laid grass down, shingle fashion. Lime whitewash on the walls, thick as plaster. A muslin ceiling stretched under the rafters to catch what sifted down. 1 window in the framed front face, 1 door, 1 stove. Counting door, sash, pipe, hinges and nails, Jacob Brandt built his home for a little under $10 cash. My father's smallest frame house that year cost a man $300. The rain came at the end of October, and it stayed 2 days, and it did what my father said water always does. It found the low place. The low place was Brandt's floor. Water walked down that bank and in through the doorway like it had been invited, and by the second morning the gravedigger was bailing his grave with a bucket, ankle deep in mud the colour of coffee. Harmon rode out to see it personally. He sat his horse in the drizzle a long while, and that Saturday the loading dock had a new line about the first man in Kansas to drown in his own funeral. My father did not laugh. He said to my mother that the German would be flooded out by Thanksgiving or frozen out by Christmas, and either way we would be taking that family soup. He said it flat, like a bid on a job. Brandt bailed the water, and then he fixed the reason for it. He walked the slope above his roof and cut a ditch across it, curved like an eyebrow, wide as a spade and deeper at the ends, so that water coming down the bank was gathered and carried off sideways, past the shoulders of the house, before it ever reached his roofline. Railroad men used the same trick above their cuts and called it a cut-off ditch. Then he raised his threshold 2 courses of limestone, set in mortar, and packed a clay apron in front of the door, with a fall away from the house. The next rain came in November, and his floor stayed dry as a Bible. My father drove past while Brandt was still smoothing the clay. He looked at the ditch a long moment, the way he looked at another man's joinery. Neither man mentioned it. But a ditch did not answer the whole of my father's case, and my father was not a man to leave a case half-argued. He drove out to the ridge one Sunday in November and made it, all of it, standing at the lip with his hat in his hand, respectful as a lawyer. I know, because he said it again at our supper table all that winter. First, the roof. Dirt drinks rain and keeps it. A sod roof will drip for 3 days after the sky has cleared, he said, onto the bed, onto the flower, onto the child. Second, the damp itself. A wall of raw earth breeds water all winter, and damp is what fills the graveyards, not cold. Consumption comes in on damp like a boarder who never leaves. Third, the weight. 2 courses of wet sod will run heavy, and a green cottonwood ridgepole sags by spring and breaks by the second one, and it does not warn you first. And fourth, the thing he cared about most, the thing that made him lower his voice, the doorway. A door set below grade is a snow trap. 1 north wind will pack that entry to the eave in a night, he said, and if the stovepipe drifts over at the same time, a family goes to sleep warm and does not wake up. This is why houses stand up out of the ground, Brandt. Men have tried the ground before. Every word of that was true. I want that understood, because this is not a story about a fool. My father was the best builder in that country, and everything he predicted came to pass, every single item, before that winter was out. Jacob Brandt listened to all of it with his hands still. Then he said, "Frost stops at 30 inches," and he went back to laying sod. The first snow came the last week of November, a small storm, as those things are measured, 8 inches on a north wind. It was enough. In the morning, the drift lay against Brandt's bank, smooth as poured cream, and his doorway was gone, packed to the lintel, solid as sacked flour, exactly as my father had promised. The stovepipe had kept its own hole, melted through the white, a little breathing mouth in the drift, and that was the only sign a family lived under there at all. Brandt dug out from the inside. It took him until noon, working the door open, inch by inch, passing snow back in a washtub for Katerina to melt on the stove. Del Harmon had a week of suppers out of that one. The Gravedigger sealed in his own plot, and the county spared the cost of a preacher. What Brandt did next is the part men remembered later, though nobody thought much of it at the time. He climbed onto his own finished roof, his good, tight, two-course roof that had cost him a month, and he cut a hole in it. Back corner, past the muslin, down through the sod and the brush. He framed a scuttle hatch out of his spare door lumber, hinged to open inward and down, with a peg ladder fixed to the wall below it and a shovel hanging on the ladder, inside the house, where a drift could never take it from him. My father heard about the hatch and asked him, plainly, why. Brandt said, "Snow shuts one door, I cut two." The repair cost him days he could not spare. It also improved the system. In the first week of December, Brandt walked into the drugstore in Hayes and bought a mercury thermometer and nailed it to his door casing on the sheltered side. And every night from that night on, he wrote 2 numbers in charcoal on the inside of his door plank. The number outside, the number inside, one above the other, like a ledger. Harmon found out, because Harmon found out everything. And he said the Gravedigger was keeping accounts with the weather now, and asked what interest the weather paid. But my father heard about the door plank and did not smile. "Careful men keep books," he said, and said no more. The season itself had begun keeping books by then. The geese went over early and low and did not linger on the river. Muskrats on Big Creek built their houses double-walled that fall, and old men noticed. Ice stood on the stock tanks an inch thick the first week of December and did not go out at noon. The signs were small, and they all leaned one way. Something was coming that would audit every house in the county. There was one more flaw in the dugout, and no man in Stone Post found it because it could not be seen. Brandt found it with a candle. In December, with the door shut and the hatch shut and the stove drawing, he took to setting a lit candle on the floor by the back wall in the evening and sitting on his heels to watch it. Well diggers the world over lower a flame before they lower a man, because a flame starves in dead air before a man knows he is starving. Brandt had shut his house up tight as a jar, and a jar is a bad thing to breathe in. One evening the flame by the back wall stood too still and burned small and blue at the root, and leaned toward the stove like it was asking for help. The next morning, Brandt tore out a yard of his finished muslin ceiling and a course of his roof. Good work, dry work, work he had done twice already, and he built a wooden box flue from the back corner up through the sod, with a nail keg for a cowl on top, cut and cocked so the wind across it would pull air up the shaft instead of stuffing snow down it. Fresh air came in low at the doorsill. Spent air went out the shaft. The house breathed with everything shut. Ed Purcell, our neighbour to the east, a fair-minded man who had lent Brandt his Fresno scraper back in October, stood looking at the finished corner and said it looked the same as it had before. And what had all that tearing been for? Brandt said, "The flame told me." By the middle of December the work was done, And I will tell you honestly what it looked like from the Hayes Road, because I rode past it in the wagon every week of my girlhood. It looked like nothing. It looked like a door and one window that some fool had propped against a grassy bank and forgotten. A stovepipe stood up out of the prairie with smoke on it, and a nail keg stood up a few yards behind the pipe, and a ditch curved above it all like a scar. That was the whole of it. That was the house. Set beside my father's houses, with their plum studs and their shiplap and their painted porches, it was absurd, and the town said so with one voice. At the Grange supper before Christmas, with half the township in the hall, Del Harmon stood up to propose the toasts, and he saved Brandt for last, and he landed the best line of his life. He said, Stone Post ought to be grateful to the German, because when the Gravedigger passed on, the county would save a full $1 on the burial, the man being pre-buried at his own expense. The hall laughed until the lamps shook. I laughed too. I was 12, and it was funny. That same week, Jacob Brandt banked the framed front face of his house with a last load of earth to the sill of the window, whitewashed his door, wrote his 2 numbers in charcoal, and went to bed. Winter was 3 weeks from giving its answer. The new year came in mild, and the mildness had a false feel to it, like a peddler's smile. Then the signs turned loud. The 3rd of January, sundogs stood beside the sun all morning, 2 cold little mock suns on leashes of light, and old men looked at them longer than they let on. Horses turned wool thick and would not settle. The chickens went to roost at midday on the 4th, and my mother stopped on the porch with the egg pail and looked north at a sky that had nothing in it at all. An empty sky, the color of dishwater, and too quiet. On the 5th of January, old Amos Crane rode out to the ridge. Amos Crane had hunted buffalo on that ground before Stone Post had a name, and he read weather the way other men read scripture, and he did not pay social calls. He rode around the dugout once, he got down, he walked the roof, tapped the ridge line with his boot heel, looked at the keg cowl, looked at the ditch, looked at the woodpile Brandt had stacked inside the entry where no drift could bury it. Then he asked Brandt one question. How deep to your floor? Brandt said, 4 feet. Crane mounted and rode back toward town, and here is what Stone Post chewed on for 2 days. He did not laugh. Amos Crane looked at the grave, and he did not laugh. The storm came on the 6th of January 1886, and it is in the books, so I do not have to ask you to take an old woman's word for it. The morning stood near 40 degrees, soft as March. By early afternoon, the wind had come round to the northwest, and the temperature began to fall like a stone dropped down a well. 10 degrees inside an hour, and the snow came on the flat, not falling but travelling, mixed with lifted dust until the whole world went the colour of ash. By supper it stood at 0, and the wind was running better than 40 miles an hour. By full dark it was 10 below, and still going. It blew all that night. It blew all the next day, and the night after that, and the day after that. 3 days, and the cold underneath the wind sank to 20 below, then past it. A man could not see his own fence. Cattle on the open range turned their tails to it and walked south until they walked into a wire or a draw or gave out. And men found some of them in April, 40 miles from home. Nature never negotiated its verdicts. Now I will tell you about the first night of that storm, in 2 houses, because I lived one of them and I read the other off a door plank. Our house was the best-built frame house in the township, and I say that without boasting, because being the best did not matter. Sawed lumber, tight joints, tar paper under good siding, my father's own work and nobody's better. The wind did not care. It came through the keyholes in a thin whistle you could put your finger on. It came around the window sash, and the lamp flames leaned when it gusted. It came under the north door across the floor in a flat river you could feel through your shoes. By midnight, there was frost on the nail heads inside the walls, every nail head wearing a little white cap, and frost creeping up the window panes an inch an hour. My father did not go to bed at all. He sat up feeding the stove, and I lay under 3 quilts with my sister and listened to it eat. We were burning a cord of wood in about 3 days that week, and the stove was drawing hard and losing anyway. Toward morning, my mother set the kettle on the shelf above the stove, the warm shelf, and by breakfast there was ice in the kettle, on the shelf. Above the stove, the thermometer by our window read 18 degrees indoors at dawn. A quarter mile away, under 4 feet of Kansas, the Brandts were having a quiet evening. I know it the way the whole county came to know it. The stove drew steady because the pipe stood short and sheltered, and the shaft kept the draught honest. Katerina had set bread dough on the shelf that evening, and the dough rose, because bread does not rise in a cold room, and hers rose all 3 nights. Marta slept through the worst wind of the decade, the way a child sleeps through rain on a roof, which is what it sounded like down there, they said. A far-off freight train that never arrived. The candle by the back wall burned tall and even, and each night of the storm, Jacob Brandt opened his door-plank ledger and wrote his 2 numbers in charcoal, the same calm entry as any other night. The night outside read 31 below. The night inside read 51 above. While he wrote it, his mule and his milk cow stood in the earth stable he had dug into the same bank 10 steps east, warm as bread in a cloth. I promised I would explain it, and this is the place, because the middle of the storm is where we finally understood it. There is no mystery in it. You have known it your whole life if you have ever kept a cellar. Frost in that country goes down about 30 inches in a hard winter, and then it stops. Below that line, the ground pays no attention to the calendar. It holds near 55 degrees the year around, winter and August alike, which is why your well never freezes, and your potatoes never do either. Jacob Brandt had not built a warm house. He had moved his family below the line where cold exists. His walls were not fighting the storm. They were standing behind it. The wind that tore at our siding all night could not touch him, because you cannot pride what you cannot reach. And his stove was not asked to hold back 31 below. It was asked to lift 55 up to comfortable. And any cook stove on a few hay twists and cow chips can do that all winter. Mind, the ground gave nothing free. The roof wept for 2 days after every thaw, into pans. The rooms were dark at noon and small as a granary bin. Without the shaft, the air would have gone bad enough to kill, and without the hatch, the snow would have jailed them, and the ridgepole would want replacing inside 10 years. It was not magic, it was arithmetic. The wind quit on the 9th, and the sun came up on a county that looked scoured and felt worse. We had come through, barely. The last night my father had burned the garden fence, picket by picket, feeding his own handiwork into the stove without a word. Others fared harder. The Purcells, east of us, had bundled all 4 children into one bed with the dog and nailed a quilt over the north door, and Ed Purcell's hands were frost-nipped white at the tips from doing the stock in that wind. And the first thing the men of Stone Post did, when a man could stand up outdoors, was hitch and drive to the ridge with shovels laid in the wagon beds. Nobody said what the shovels were for. Everybody knew. They were going to dig out the bodies of the Gravedigger and his family. What they found was a drift running smooth up the bank to the roofline, and the front face scoured grey, whitewash sanded clean off by 3 days of driven snow, one window pane cracked from the cold. The outside of that house had taken a beating, and cut down through the drift to the door, neat as cellar stairs, was a set of snow steps, kept clear all 3 days by a man with an inside shovel, and the door standing open to the morning, and heat rolling up out of that doorway so plain you could see it shiver the air. My father walked down into it ahead of them all and stopped, and stood in the warmth with his eyes shut, and I have never forgotten his face. Inside, the lamp was lit, and the room smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Marta was at the table dressing a corn-husk doll, and on the back of the door, in charcoal, stood the 2 columns of numbers, 3 days of them, the outside figures falling to 31 below, and the inside figures standing in a straight, boring, beautiful row, 50, 51, 50. The numbers required no interpretation. Ed Purcell pulled off his glove and put his bare palm flat against the whitewashed wall, and held it there, and said, To the wall more than to anyone, I was wrong. My father asked only one thing. He asked what it had held at, the worst of it. Brandt said 50, every night. 50. And that was all the crowing there ever was on that ridge, from any man, forever. My father never did say those words, and I will not pretend he did. What he did instead was stand a long while working the scuttle hatch up and down on its hinges, studying it the way he studied things. Then he went home and got his rule and came back and measured the entry, and Jacob Brandt stood beside him and held the far end of the tape. The news that came in over the following weeks put the numbers in their frame. That cold wave killed some 80 people in Kansas, travellers and herders and families in frame shanties like the one the Brandts had left. On the open ranges south and west of us, the cattle died by the 100,000 that winter, and there were big outfits that never recovered from it. Stone Post buried nobody, but Stone Post had shivered all but one family, and a town remembers who was warm. In April, Ed Purcell walked his own south bank with a spade, cutting sample holes, and by June he was 4 feet down. His was the first. 2 more families dug the next fall, and by the 3rd autumn there were 5 earth houses within a day's drive of Stone Post, and men who had laughed at the Grange supper were asking Brandt, respectfully, about ridgepoles and cut-off ditches. He answered every question the same way he dug, slowly and all the way down. My father, the carpenter, never apologized and never dug. What he did was better. He looked at the one weakness the storm had shown, that buried doorway, and he framed his answer to it, an entry porch dug in the shape of a letter L, with an outer door and an inner door, so the north wind had to make 2 turns in the dark to find the family, and no drift could lie against the inner door at all. He built the first one on Purcell's dugout and took pay for it. Jacob Brandt walked around that entry twice, looking, and built one onto his own house the next fall. Between the 2 of them, without one warm word ever passing, they improved each other for 20 years. Del Harmon went quiet on the subject, the way such men do, and his ledgers made the adjustment his mouth would not. Earth houses buy no siding, but every one of them buys a door, a sash, a stovepipe, and hinges, and Harmon sold them cheerfully to the end of his days. The old name wore out like a boot. Nobody in Stone Post said the Gravedigger anymore. They said the Warm House. And when there were 6 of them, and then 10, folks around the county came to call any snug earth home the Dutchman's stove, and most of them never knew there had been a particular Dutchman, or that his mule was afraid of umbrellas, or that a pair of small shoes stood on a shelf above his stove for 50 years, and were dusted every day, and never once explained. I am an old woman now, older than Amos Crane was when he did not laugh. The dugout is a potato cellar these days, and the L-shaped entry my father built still turns the wind twice, and the charcoal numbers are still on the door plank, gone soft and grey like everything true. People ask me what I learned in the hard winters, expecting something about grit. I give them the old man's saying instead. Winter owns the wind, and the wind will always find your keyholes, and your sash, and your pride. But winter has never yet owned the ground. The ground belongs to whoever is humble enough to ask it for shelter, and patient enough to dig. Some men shout at the storm. The wise ones stand where it cannot reach. Now the characters in this story are ours, but here is what is true. Dugout homes were the first shelter for thousands of families on the Central Plains, and a Kansas homesteader named Howard Rood, writing home in 1877, priced his at about $10, most of it the window, the door, and the stovepipe. The Volga German families who settled Ellis County, Kansas, beginning in 1876, brought the earth house from the Russian steppe, where they called it a semlin, along with the hard red winter wheat of 1874 that remade Kansas farming. Below the frost line, the ground does hold near 55 degrees the year around, And that is the whole secret. And the blizzard and cold wave of early January 1886 is in the record books. It killed some 80 people in Kansas alone, and cattle beyond counting on the southern ranges. And the winters of those years ended the open range for good. The people are imagined, the knowledge is not.